All right, ready for a deep dive into one of history's biggest what-ifs?
I'm game if you are. What are we diving into today?
The 1929 financial crisis. And not just how it happened, but how different could things have been? Like, what if a butterfly flapping its wings in, I don't know, Tokyo somehow prevented the Great Depression?
The butterfly effect. Love it. It's definitely a thought-provoking way to look at such a complex event. Because, yeah, we usually fixate on the crash itself, but those seeds were sown way earlier, right?
Right. It's easy to imagine the Roaring Twenties as all champagne and flapper dresses, but how much of that is just our romanticized image?
Well, there was a ton of growth and optimism. You had radios, automobiles, all this new tech transforming everyday life. Plus, the stock market was on fire. But
There's always a but.
yeah, this masked some seriously shaky economic foundation.
Like, give us the rundown.
So, speculation in the stock market was out of control. People were buying on margin, basically borrowing money to buy stocks, assuming prices would just keep skyrocketing.
Their old get-rich-quick dream.
Exactly. And easy credit fueled the whole thing. Banks were handing out loans left and right, barely any oversight. And on top of that, you had international trade imbalances.
Us. Didn't help that we slapped on those tariffs.
Yeah, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, meant to protect American industries, but really it backfired, hurt global trade, just made everything worse.
Okay, so we've got this potent mix of risky lending, wild speculation, and global tension. Where do those crucial butterfly wings even come into play?
Let's start with the big dog, the Federal Reserve, the Fed. Their decisions on interest rates, making credit easier or harder to get, that's huge. And in the years before the crash, they were, well, hesitant to raise interest rates, even with that speculation bubble growing bigger and bigger.
Worried about rocking the boat? Killing the good times.
Basically, they were afraid of stifling economic growth. But not acting, it came with a hefty price tag.
Hold up, let's rewind. What if the Fed had actually pumped the brakes a little earlier? Raised those rates, made borrowing a bit tougher. Could that have taken some of the air out of the bubble, maybe prevented the whole thing from imploding?
It's definitely possible. Tighter credit could have slowed that speculative frenzy, right? Given everyone a second to think, hey, maybe this is a little too good to be true, might have dodged that catastrophic domino effect.
Okay, so the Fed's role, that's one butterfly. What about the guy in charge at the time, Herbert Hoover? Becomes president in 28, just before the music stopped. How did his approach, or lack thereof, factor into all this?
Right. Hoover, he was a big believer in laissez-faire economics. Hands off, let the market sort itself out. Pretty common back then, but looking back, it's like, what if?
What if he'd actually, done something?
Exactly. What if early on his administration had implemented some regulations on speculation or tried to rein in those risky lending practices we talked about? Who knows for sure, but it makes you wonder, maybe a more proactive approach could have softened the blow.
All right, so we've got the Fed, we've got the president. Who else is a major player in this what-if game?
We can't talk about 29 without mentioning JP Morgan. Talk about financial clout. This guy was practically Wall Street royalty. Back in 1907, during the panic, he was instrumental. Rallied other big players, poured money back into the system, basically saved the day.
So could he have pulled off a repeat performance in 29? Was that even possible?
$1 million question. Some historians will tell you, no way, the situation was just too big, too far gone, even for someone like Morgan. But there's another side to that coin. Some believe his leadership, his willingness to step in, that could have made a difference. Maybe even stopped the crash from hitting rock bottom. It's one of those historical what-ifs we'll be debating forever.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing, and even a titan like JP Morgan, the guy who come to the rescue before maybe. He couldn't have stopped it this time. So what happens next?
Well, despite all the warning signs, the party kept going for a bit longer. But by September 1929, things started getting shaky. A few small dips in the market, but everybody just shrugged them off.
They'd been riding high for so long, it's like they thought it would last forever.
Exactly. Invulnerability is a hell of a drug. But then, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the day the music really stopped.
Paint a picture for us. What actually went down that day? Take us inside the New York Stock Exchange.
Imagine it, the floor of the exchange. Pandemonium. Traders yelling, phones ringing off the hook, ticker tapes spitting out numbers like crazy. It was pure chaos. And the Dow Jones, that day alone, plummeted almost 13%.
13% in
Yeah.
one single day.
Yeah. One day. It was a full-on market panic. Everyone was selling anything to get rid of their stocks before they became worthless, and the scale of it all, unprecedented.
And this wasn't some isolated Wall Street thing, right? The whole country got hit.
Oh, absolutely. Banks, they'd loaned out mountains of cash for all those now worthless stocks, and they started collapsing left and right. Then businesses, starved for credit, watching consumer spending dry up, they started shutting down. Millions out of work, savings wiped out, losing their homes. What started on Wall Street? It was a tidal wave. The whole economy was underwater.
It's hard to even grasp that feeling, that kind of collective fear and uncertainty, watching your whole world just crumble.
And it wasn't just fear, it was real hardship. Unemployment in the US shot up to 25%. 1 in 4 people out of work. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Shanty towns, they call them Hoovervilles, popping up everywhere as people lost their homes. Just a brutal time.
And it wasn't just the economic impact, right? This had huge ripple effects. Social, political.
You're absolutely right. The whole global political landscape was shaken up. Take Europe, for example. All that economic despair, the social unrest, it created this breeding ground for extremism. Fascism took root and grew. Like the Nazi Party in Germany, they were a fringe group before the Depression. Suddenly, they're gaining massive support, exploiting people's fears, their economic anxieties.
It's scary how much economic instability can ripple outward, even change the course of history.
And that's the core of the butterfly effect, isn't it? One seemingly small change, one flap of those wings can spiral out, trigger these huge, unforeseen consequences.
So we've seen just how devastating the crash and the Depression were. But did anything good come out of it? Did we at least learn some tough lessons from all that economic chaos?
Yeah, you could say that. The Great Depression, it was a brutal wake-up call. It made everyone rethink how economies work, how involved governments should be. And it led to some really important changes. I mean, it shattered that whole idea that the market could just regulate itself. That laissez-faire approach, totally dominant before, basically went out the window.
Yeah, that obviously hadn't worked out so well.
To say the least, people realized, hey, maybe we need some rules, some oversight. And that's where we see some of the biggest, longest-lasting effects of the Depression. Like in the US, that's when we got the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC.
Wall Street's watchdog, right?
Exactly. The SEC came along to regulate the stock market, try to prevent that reckless speculation that caused the '29 crash, protect investors, a direct response to those earlier failures.
So no more Wild West on Wall Street.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but definitely a step towards greater transparency, more accountability. And then there's Social Security.
One of the biggest social programs in American history.
Absolutely. Social Security, that came in '35 to give a safety net to millions of Americans, the elderly, unemployed, disabled. It showed this recognition that, hey, the government has a role to play and needs to ensure the well-being of its citizens, especially during tough economic times.
And this was part of a larger shift, right, towards the government being more involved in the economy.
You're thinking of FDR and his New Deal. That whole thing was a direct response to the Depression. All those programs, reforms, they were about relief, recovery, and reform. Putting people back to work, strengthening banks, creating a whole new set of rules for how the economy worked.
So if we loop back to that butterfly effect we talked about, the 1929 crash, as awful as it was, it also sparked some incredibly significant changes. Changes that still affect us today.
I think that's a really important point. The Great Depression, even with all that devastation, it made us confront some fundamental questions about economic policy, about social responsibility, the role of government, and it pushed us toward a more regulated, more stable, and you could argue more equitable society.
It's a powerful reminder that even the worst events can sometimes lead to profound positive change. It's like those butterflies, those seemingly small actions, they can have huge consequences for better or worse.
Absolutely, and it reminds us to learn from those mistakes, stay vigilant, and keep questioning our systems so we don't repeat history.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 1929 crash and its aftermath, what's the biggest thing you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I think it's this. Those decisions we make, whether it's us as individuals, as a country, they have consequences. And those ripples can spread much further than we realize. The 1929 crash, it wasn't some unavoidable force of nature. It was a chain of choices, a perfect storm of events. Maybe if things had been different, we might have seen a completely different outcome. And that's worth remembering today, right? As we deal with our own complex, interconnected world.
What systems, what safeguards do we have today to try and prevent another Great Depression? What butterfly wings are flapping right now that we should be watching out for? Those are questions worth thinking about. This has been a fascinating deep dive into a turning point in history. Thanks for joining us.